Hi everyone, welcome to Free Prep Hour. We're going to get started in just a moment. In the meantime, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, I'd love to hear from you. Let us know your name and where you're joining from, maybe a little bit about your LSAT study journey so far. Hi Colleen, welcome. It looks like where you're from got cut off a little bit in your chat. Awesome. Welcome from Ontario. And Deanna, am I saying your name right? Welcome from San Francisco. That's awesome. I was just over there. I live in Oakland, so I'm right across the bridge from you. My name is Allie, and I am an LSAT instructor for Manhattan Prep. I'm also a GMAT instructor, an instructor manager, and the manager of training programs. And I've worked with Manhattan Prep for about 11 years now. And I'm excited to be with y'all today for this free prep hour. For those folks who are just joining, you might see in the chat there are some introductions. The chat will be your primary means of participation today. So if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, feel free to share your name and where you're joining us from. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So many folks who are coming to the free prep hours are interested in finding additional resources to support their LSAT prep. So I wanted to share a couple with you from the get-go. One is a free trial of session 1 of our live online LSAT classes. Session 1 is a 3-hour course that primarily dives into the fundamentals of arguments that support the logical reasoning section and an introduction to logic games. We dive deep into a specific type of logic game and also learn the basic 4-step process that you want to use. Thanks for the introduction, Jawad. Welcome from Pakistan. It's great to have folks from all over the world today. We've got 3 different countries represented so far. Another free option that you can try is our LSAT Interact, which is a really neat video-based adaptive course that provides you with both lessons and practice that adjusts based on how you're doing with the problems that you're presented. If you're interested in checking those out, as well as some additional resources like our blogs and forums, you can visit our website to find out more. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk about one of the most daunting challenges of the LSAT, which is how to get better at reading comprehension. Oftentimes, when I meet students for the first time, they have a preconceived notion of who they are as a reader and how they're going to do on their reading comp section. And this is an area where it seems to often be really difficult for folks to have a growth mindset. People often say, I just don't know how to improve at it, so I'm going to focus on getting better at the other 2 areas. But it is possible to grow in reading comprehension. And my goal today is to help you make reading comprehension feel more manageable, more bite-sized, and have a better idea of what steps you can take to grow in reading comprehension. So the 3 major things that help people grow in reading comprehension are 1, diagnosis, so having a really good sense of where exactly your strengths are in reading comp and also where exactly you have room for growth. Second, taking that knowledge into specific goals that guide your studying. And third, frequently pausing to reflect on and review those goals. So today, we're going to take a look at a real LSAT passage and use that to self-diagnose our own strengths and weaknesses in reading comp, and start thinking about goals that might help us make progress in reading comp. So to get us started, I'm going to put a passage on the screen in just a moment. You may want to have a pen and paper handy if you are someone who likes to take any sort of notes while you read on the LSAT. I might also encourage you to have your phone handy so that you can use the timer feature, or you could even just open another window on your computer and go to Google and type in timer and use the timer feature of Google. Because one of the things I'm going to ask you to diagnose after you've done this passage is, how long did it take you? That's a great starting point for thinking about how your timing looks on the reading comprehension section. Right now, I'm just going to give you the passage itself and no questions. And your job is to read the passage in the same way that you would read it on the actual test. And I will give you a few questions after you're done reading the passage and we've talked about it. So different folks take different amounts of time to read a passage. And because we're focused on diagnosis, rather than give you a hard cutoff that might interrupt your reading, I'm going to set a timer for myself for around 5 minutes. And then after 5 minutes, we'll move on. That may mean that some of you finish the passage a little bit before the timer goes off. And I encourage you to take that time to reflect a little bit on what your experience was like reading this passage. How were you feeling? What were the places in the passage where you felt a little bit stuck? And what did you do in those moments? How would you rate your comprehension of the passage? All right, so I'm going to put the passage on the screen. And as soon as it pops up on the screen, I'm going to start my timer, and I encourage you to start yours whenever you start reading. So here it is, and I'll check back in with you in 5 minutes. All right, everyone, that was 5 minutes. I hope you enjoyed the passage and were able to make a note of your time on the passage. So as I mentioned, the first focus of this reading comp lesson is going to be on self-diagnosis. And what I want to start with is giving you some questions to help you reflect on that experience of reading this passage. So I'm going to be quiet again for a moment and just give you an opportunity. I'd like for you to read each of these questions and actually write down a response. And if you're not sure what the question means, that's actually helpful information. So just put a question mark on your paper next to that one. Like if you don't know what I mean for number 6 by a passage map, then put a little question mark there. So I'm going to just be quiet for about 3 minutes while you reflect and write down your answers. And then I'm going to talk you through what to make of each of these questions and how you responded to it. All right, take a moment now to write your response. All right, I'm going to cover up some of the questions so we can engage with each of them one at a time and talk about what to make of the reflections that you wrote down. How can this diagnosis be useful to you? So let's start with number 1. How long did it take you to read the passage? So here, the goal of this question is to help you determine whether A, speed might be impacting your comprehension, and B, whether your reading speed might be eating up time that would be better spent in the questions. So here's how I would think about this. Generally speaking, a reading comp passage on the LSAT might take someone in the range from about 2.5 minutes to 4 minutes to read. Now, that's not to say it couldn't take longer. You may have found, yeah, I could totally use all 5 of the minutes that were given just to spend reading this passage. But we find that this is kind of the sweet spot in terms of being able to balance reading the whole passage and understanding it, and then being able to answer all of the questions. There's often about 5 to 7 questions after a passage. And if you were to split your time on each passage evenly, then you have 8 minutes and 30 seconds for each passage set. So for each to read the passage and do all of the questions. So if you're closer to the 2.5 minute mark, then you're going to have about 6 minutes for those, 5 to 7 questions. So you'll be getting closer to a minute per question. If you're closer to the 4 minute mark, then you're going to have significantly less than a minute per question. And finding a sweet spot is a balancing point for many people. So if you're getting, your time is closer to the 2.5 minute mark, then you definitely want to reflect on how strong your comprehension is. So if you're at the 2.5 minute mark and you felt you had a high level of comprehension, great, that's a great reading spot for you. It is also possible to be reading a little too fast. And so you want to ask yourself, is my speed interfering with my comprehension? And if you are reading this passage in 2.5 minutes, but feeling like you maybe understood 60% of it, then that would be an indicator to you that you have time to slow down, maybe add a minute to your reading time so that you can come away with a better comprehension. On the flip side, if you're closer to 4 minutes, that's starting to really compete with the amount of time that you have to answer the questions. Some LSAT takers find it really, beneficial to get that nice, thorough read. Then they have such a strong understanding of the passage that they're able to answer the questions really quickly. And that's something that you can really only find out for yourself. But what you want to ask yourself if you're at the 4 minute mark is, when I do a question set, do I feel overly rushed on the questions? Or is this building up my confidence and I'm able to get through the questions just fine? Some people create a sort of a deliberate strategy where maybe they spend a little longer on the passage and they skip a question, but they know that their accuracy is higher on the remaining questions because they spent longer on the passage read. And that's great too. You just want to be aware of how your reading pace is impacting your performance on the questions, whether that's, it's increasing your ability to get questions right because you're taking your time, or it's decreasing it because you're feeling too rushed. So that's the first area for diagnosis is, do I need to work to adjust my reading speed? And we'll talk about how you might do that when we get to the goal setting portion of this lesson. Second question, on a scale of 0 to 100, how would you rate your comprehension of the passage? So in a typical reading comprehension setting, as readers, our goal is to understand 90 to 100% of a passage in order to be able to say, like, yes, I got that. On the LSAT, that comprehension might drop a little bit because we're reading dense academic text in a very rushed setting. So I encourage you to think about your comprehension first in relative terms. So there might be some passages where you walk away from that passage and you're like, gosh, I understood maybe 50% of that. And on other passages, you might say, yeah, actually, I did understand 90% of that. And what you can do with that information is then think about, what are the factors that are causing this discrepancy between your 50% passages and your 90% passages. Some common factors include vocabulary, background knowledge. So by vocabulary, I mean, some passages introduce a lot of complex language that might be content specific that you are unfamiliar with. Background knowledge, so if you were a science major, the science passages might feel familiar because you've read a lot on the topic. Whereas if you were not a science major and you haven't done a lot of science reading, that may impact how quickly you're able to absorb the information because you don't have a pre-existing context for it. It might also be the passage organization. So maybe it didn't seem to be organized in a way that felt predictable to you. And it could also be the way that you're feeling or the amount of time that you have. And pinpointing what is it that was impacting my comprehension on these different passages helps you understand, okay, what do I need to work on then? If the primary thing impacting your read of the passage is time, then you want to think about, is there a way to balance my time so that I have more time to read? Or on the flip side, are there strategies that I can use to get more out of my reading in the limited amount of time that I have? So maybe I need to adjust what I'm focusing on when I read, or maybe I need to implement repair strategies more frequently or earlier so that I don't end up rereading an entire paragraph in order to understand it. We'll talk in a moment about what to think about if how your feeling impacted your comprehension level. Things like vocabulary, background knowledge, and organization can all be improved by doing additional reading. So in particular, it can be really helpful to do complex academic reading in the topic areas that are tested by the LSAT, but not using LSAT passages. So in other words, shifting some of your free reading time to read The Economist if you find the business more sort of economic oriented passages to be really challenging for you, or to read Scientific American if you find the science passages to be really challenging. They can also be enhanced, particularly vocabulary and organization, by learning strategies. So learning some strategies for how to handle unfamiliar vocabulary, learning some strategies for tracking the organization of a passage, and even building your LSAT content knowledge. So learning what are the different organizational structures that tend to show up in each of the different content areas on the LSAT. All of that can help. You don't necessarily need to be doing all of those things, which is why diagnosing is helpful. You want to pick out which of these things feel like the biggest pain point from my understanding right now. Third question is about strategy use. So first, what strategies did you use to actively read? If you weren't sure what I meant by this question and nothing popped into mind, I'm going to share some strategies with you. Sometimes people are using these strategies, but they're just not aware of it. And sometimes they're just not using these strategies because they didn't realize it was the thing they should be doing. So try to identify, were you, while you were reading this passage, stopping to summarize? Whether that was summarizing in note form or summarizing in your head, where you kind of pausing, like, okay, so they said blah, blah, blah. Were you actively predicting? So was your brain kind of taking like, okay, I think I know what's coming next. I think I know where this is going. You might know that that happened if you had some moments where you read the text and you were like, yeah, that's kind of going in a direction that I thought it was going to be going. Were you noticing when your comprehension broke down? So were you kind of like, okay, yeah, like right, I'm getting it. Ooh, wait, what did that say? And when were you asking questions? So were you actively thinking like, oh, I wonder what's this farming strategy that they're going to share, or like by the Netherlands, or just actively engaging with the text. These strategies are all really important for many reasons. First of all, using these strategies improves comprehension. And secondly, it also helps to deal with the feelings of time pressure and anxiousness that can come with a reading comprehension passage. And finally, all of these help you to engage with the text in a way that will set you up successfully to answer questions. Which brings me to the second thing you want to think about is, what were you doing in moments when you needed to repair your comprehension? What I mean by that is, in those moments when you notice, like, when you're thinking, what did that just say? Or I don't get this part, I'm a little confused. What did you do? Did you just keep going? Or did you stop and try something? And if you stopped and tried something, did it work? So I'll give you an example. When I was reading this passage in order to prepare for this lesson today, I was feeling a little bit anxious about it at first. So I read the first sentence and I saw some words, and I could have told you, like, it's about agriculture in Europe, but that's it. And I knew, like, I do not want to go further in this passage with that really shaky understanding of the first sentence. I'm just going to end up coming back to reread. So I stopped. And in that moment, I reread the sentence, which is one strategy you can use to repair comprehension. I paused to take notes, and I summarized in my own words. And in particular, I tried to take what that first sentence said and kind of reorder the parts just to make sure that I was understanding the relationship. And so I kind of switched around the order in which the ideas were presented and wrote down my understanding of what it meant. I didn't keep writing everything for the whole passage, but I did it in the moments in particular when I felt like I was not understanding. So the point here is that you should, A, notice when you're not understanding something, and B, make an active decision about what to do. There is an option I haven't mentioned, which is sometimes it's totally fine to just keep going. How do you know the difference? Well, you definitely want to stop and fix your comprehension if you are just starting the passage, if you are transitioning to sort of a new part of the passage, so they're presenting a new study, or if they're presenting a different person's point of view, or if it seems to be a general big idea or author's opinion in the study. If, on the other hand, you're kind of getting the gist of what, the point is of this paragraph that you're reading, but they start going into the minutia, and there's like all these details, and that part is like a little bit intense and not totally making sense. That's okay. You don't have to have 100% comprehension of all the details, and you might make a deliberate choice. I'm going to keep going. Okay. Fourth question. How did you feel while you were reading the passage? So you might have noticed yourself, for example, feeling distracted, feeling confident, feeling interested, feeling bored, feeling anxious, feeling frustrated. All of those can have an impact on your comprehension when you read. So one thing to pay attention to when you're diagnosing yourself in reading comprehension is, are my feelings interfering with my ability to read this effectively as possible? Do I have thoughts that are floating into my head that are getting in the way of understanding this passage? If so, a great first step is to start exploring some mindfulness techniques, which can teach you how to deal with the thoughts that are floating into all of our heads when we're reading these passages, and how to effectively manage them so that you're able to still concentrate on what's in front of you. Question number 5 is, did you find the author's opinion? This is a pretty concrete question, kind of yes or no. And in order to answer it, you should really be able to go back to the question and pinpoint a sentence or two, or a line or two, where you found that the author stated their opinion. And ideally, you would also have jotted it down in your notes, or if you are someone who's highlighting on the LSAT Flex interface, maybe you highlighted it. And I asked this question just because it's a really high priority for being able to answer questions on the test correctly, but it's often something that people don't realize is so important. So just, did you do it, yes or no? If no, then a clear step for you next time is to make sure that you do try to find the author's opinion. And finally, can you articulate a passage map? That means, can you kind of lay out the structure of how the passage was organized? I'm going to show you, just kind of hold them up to the camera, my notes and how I tracked the passage throughout, so you can get a sense of what I mean here. So nothing fancy at all. You can see just that I kind of was making a few bullet point notes as I was discovering different points or changes in the passage. So in the first paragraph, there were a couple of places where I thought, okay, the author is making their point here. They're saying, sort of getting this unused farmland, restoring it back to its natural conditions is going to be hard. And then I noticed the author was laying out reasons. So I wrote reasons, and then I just kind of skipped over, I read the next part, but I didn't write down all the reasons because I was like, okay, I know where they are. I can come back to them. And then I noticed, there was this question of, can we accelerate the timeline? And there was a study about that. So I jotted down, okay, here's this question, here's this study, and kind of the key takeaway from the study. That's what I mean by passage map, is are you tracking the ideas throughout the passage as they change? Can you clearly note the points where the passage transitions from one idea to another? Do you understand the purpose of each of the different sections of the passage? If not, then a great thing to do is to start practicing creating written passage maps and taking as much time as you need to build that habit. All right, so I'm going to ask everybody right now to take a moment and in the chat, tell us one thing that you discovered about your reading from this diagnosis. So maybe one answer to one of the questions, or just one thing you're noticing in response to these questions we just went through. You can put it in the chat. Cool, that's a great reflection, Brian. Need to read more science content to get more comfortable with the subject. Super helpful. What else? Nerves play a factor. Yeah, that's really common. Thank you for sharing that, Colleen. That's really great thing to notice. Keep on coming. And what I'm seeing, and what y'all are probably seeing as well, is each of these is a very different response. And that makes a ton of sense. So what a lot of people are looking for is like a one-size-fits-all guide to like how to get better at reading comp. But this is why diagnosis is so important, because what's going to help Colleen is going to be different from what will help Brian. And so once you know what you need to work on, you can start picking out, okay, what is like the section of a reading comp guide that I should be paying careful attention to? Or what are some drills or exercises that I can do, or goals I can set when I practice? Great, Michael, that's good to hear that you find yourself rereading when you do not understand. So that's a strength that you're noticing through your diagnosis. And it's really important to pay attention when we're diagnosing in this way to what we're already doing well that's helping us, so that we can positively reinforce that and keep doing. All right, so that was diagnosis at the passage level. Typically, when we're working on reading comprehension, we want to think about what are we doing to maximize our time spent reading the passage, but then also what's happening when we go through the questions. What are some of the specific moves we're making or not making that are helping us get questions right or causing us to get questions wrong? So in order to figure that out, we're going to go ahead and do a question or two. And once again, I encourage you to time yourself. So I'm going to time you. And I'll probably give you maybe 2.5 minutes before I check in. That's not necessarily how much time you should use to answer this question on the test, but I want to allow for you to see, like, okay, at my natural pace, how long do I need to answer this question right now in this moment? And then once we're done with the question, we'll of course review it, but we will also think about our diagnosis and reflection. All right, so here comes the question. There you go. Maybe 2.5 minutes. All right, everybody. That's about 2.5 minutes. So I'm going to put up some reflection questions now. And I will talk you through this question and the question type and tendency. Excuse me. And tendencies. So for now, if you're not sure about that, you can just, write down on your paper, I don't know. But I do want you to think about each of these questions for a moment before you hear an explanation while your process is fresh in your mind. So I'll give you about 2 minutes to read these questions, reflect, and jot down some of your thoughts on your paper. All right, let's go back to the question and review it. And I will put these answers back up once we have gone over it together. So first, I'm going to put up a poll and ask y'all to just let me know your answer. This will be anonymous. Tell me the answer you chose. Trying to get everybody voting. All right. Thank you. So let's talk through this question. So the question type for this question is a main idea question. And one of the reflections was, did you know what strategy to use? So if you recognize this as a main idea question, then think about, did you have a particular approach in mind for this question? With main idea questions, there are a few strategies that can be really helpful. The first one that I like to do is to revisit what I identified as the author's opinion. And sometimes the author's opinion will have evolved throughout the text. So that might mean looking back at my notes or taking a quick glance at the multiple places where I identified the author's opinion. Or if I had a really strong comprehension, I might just think about it in my head. So in this case, I'll share with you a couple places in the text where I identified the author's opinion. One of those was in the first paragraph. I saw several elements of opinionated language. I saw that the author thinks that restoring a natural balance will be difficult, that removing and replacing the topsoil is impractical. So those were two kind of challenges where the author used opinionated language to describe what their thinking was. And then I was curious as I was reading about this study in the Netherlands, whether the author was going to disclose their opinion about it. And I do get some indications of the author's beliefs. The word suggest is often an indication of what the author thinks might be true. So the author shared these results, suggests that this hinges on restoring the diversity of microorganisms in the soil, and then share this belief of researchers that this could be beneficial if these microorganisms are sown along with plant seeds. Okay, so generally, if I'm summarizing the author's opinion, they're trying to say it's going to be hard to restore the natural balance to this unused agricultural land, but there is a strategy that is supported by science. So I'm gonna take a look now at the answer choices, and I'm keeping that prediction in mind. All right, so the first answer choice A, talks about ways to accelerate the rehabilitation of land using a two-pronged strategy. And it seems to be positive. It says it can be accelerated. So that lines up with the author's opinion that I noted. So I'm going to hang on to that answer. Answer choice B, restoring plant diversity to overused farmland requires many years and considerable effort. I do know that this was stated. So I know, for example, in the first paragraph, the author expressed that this will be difficult, but this does seem to be missing a critical part of what I identified as the author's opinion in my prediction. And one of the things that I know about the tendencies of main idea questions is that oftentimes incorrect answers are going to be too narrow in scope, meaning they are accurate. The passage did say that, but they don't comprehensively summarize everything the author wanted to prove with this passage. And if I were just to say all the author wanted to prove with this passage was that it's hard to restore plant diversity, that would be kind of completely leaving out the point of this whole Netherlands study. So because I know the tendencies of these main idea questions, I'm able to more quickly identify this as a trap answer and get rid of it. Answer choice C, the damaging effects of long-term agricultural overproduction argue for the modification of current agricultural practices. So I do see part of what I'm looking for here again. I know that the author thinks that long-term agricultural overproduction is pretty damaging. But I know that this last portion of the answer choice is another LSAT trap. This is where we sort of take the evidence we've been given and use it to argue for an opinion that was not actually stated in the passage. So the author never says, let's change current agricultural practices. They're focused primarily on how can we take this land that used to be used for agriculture and get it back to its natural state. So this is something that's an example of getting a little bit out of scope. So this is where we have some language that is supported by the text, but then we use that language to go beyond what the author actually said. We can't prove they believe that. Answer choice D is actually contradicted by the passage. The passage says that the land, well, I mean, it's not totally contradicted, right? Because it says it will take a really long time. But it's definitely not the author's only point. So we could identify it as narrow scope and maybe partially contradicted. The author's not trying to emphasize that it will gradually replenish itself. The author's saying, yeah, maybe it'll do that, but it's going to take a long time to do. And then answer choice E is another example of something that is pretty narrow in scope. Just as I glance at it, I'm thinking like, okay, they only talked about that in one little portion of the last paragraph. All right, so correct answer here is A, and I want to take this back to our reflection questions now that you've seen that. So in reflection, I want you to think about your question speed. If you got this incorrect, do you think you rushed, right? So could you have slowed down? Would slowing down have helped? If you got this correct, was there anything that could have helped you get it correct faster? So for example, are there any tendencies of wrong answers that had you known like, oh yeah, narrow scope answers are pretty much always wrong, you would have been able to more quickly and confidently eliminate that? Did you recognize the question type as a main idea question? And did you know that these questions should be answered by revisiting the author's opinion, looking for a comprehensive answer, and watching out for narrow scope traps? Returning to the text. So with main idea questions, the typical goal that we're striving for is either we don't need to return to the text at all, we just look at our notes, or we just look at the author's opinion. And we should be doing that before we look at the answer choices. So think about whether that's what you did. Did you use your notes, the text, the author's opinion, or just your memory to create a prediction before you looked at the answers? When you think about justifications for eliminating answer choices, were the justifications that you used similar to the ones that I described, or were you going with a feel? This is important because sometimes we get questions right, but the reason that we're getting questions right is not going to help us get questions right in the future. For example, sometimes we eliminate answers because we're like, I didn't remember reading that one. Or I don't like the way that answer choice is worded. But those aren't really reasons that are going to hold up against some of the more difficult questions on the LSAT. So we want to make sure we can eliminate for reasons like this word in the answer choice or this phrase was definitely not supported by the text, or this was contradicted, or this is true, but it's narrow in scope. We don't necessarily have to always have those playing in our mind verbatim when we're doing the question, but we do want to make sure that we're pushing ourselves to eliminate for valid reasons. And then finally, what proof did you have for the answer that you chose? So did you have specific line references in mind that made you really confident this was the correct answer? In particular, with these main idea questions, there's something I think of as the 3-line test, which is, do I see support for my answer in 3 different places in the text? All right, so this is an example of how you would diagnose your question level skills. And I'd love to hear in the chat, what is something that you learned about a strength of yours from this diagnosis, or something that you learned you'd like to do differently? Tell me in the chat. Cool, ability to read quickly. Is that a strength, Rahel, or something that you need to work on? Strength, awesome, that's great. Yeah, that's a really wonderful takeaway. If you did find yourself having to reread, making a better passing map will absolutely help with that. Okay, so I want to take us into goal setting. But first, I just want to kind of share with you other types of diagnosis that you might do. So the question we just looked at was one very common question type on the LSAT, which is a main idea question. If you're doing a thorough self-diagnosis, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to the types of questions that you get correct and incorrect on a broader scale. So the 3 major categories of questions we see on the LSAT are main idea questions, which we put in the bucket of synthesis questions. So that includes like, what is the author's opinion? How is this passage organized? Anything that's kind of big picture. And we also have inference questions and identification or detail questions. So this question here asks for like, basically, what did the passage say? Passage offers which explanation. That's identification. That's all about, are you able to quickly go back to the text and search for details to verify an answer choice? And then there's inference questions, which will ask things like, what is most likely to be true, or what does the passage suggest? This is also all about going back to the passage and looking for evidence and thinking about what is a reasonable inference based on this evidence. What is the most provable? So what you want to think about is, for each of these different question types, how long does it take you to answer them? Do you recognize the different ways that question can present itself? Do you know the tendencies and the strategies to use for each of those question types? When are you returning to the text, and is it at the right time, and is it in an efficient way? Are you finding the right type of justifications to eliminate wrong answers and to prove your correct answers? And digging into that really deeply for each of these question types will help you identify, okay, where exactly in this process do I have room for growth? Once you have a good sense of that, you want to get into setting goals for yourself. So one of the big things that I see holding people back from making growth in reading come is that their way of practicing is just doing passages and questions over and over again. And the problem with that is that if you don't have a specific goal in mind when you do a passage or question set, then you're really just reinforcing the habits that you already have that are leading to your current performance. So if you want your performance to change, after you identify the weak points in your process, you need to then figure out what is the specific strategy that I am going to use to change those habits. And then you need to practice it and reflect on it until it becomes a habit. Because we've been reading for our whole lives and we've been tested on reading for our whole lives, which means our existing habits are really deeply ingrained. And if they're not working for us, it's probably going to take some work in order to change those habits. So let's think about what goal-oriented studying will look like. So here are a few common goals that I hear from students when they reflect on their work. They say, I'm going to read faster. I'm going to pay better attention. I'm going to read the answers more carefully. These aren't really strategies. They're more like outcomes. When you think about strategies that you want to set as your goals, they need to be something where there's a concrete action. You know what you're going to do in order to target this outcome. So rather than setting a goal of, I will read faster, you might set a goal of, I will skim examples and lists when I see them in the text. You might set a goal of, I will speed up when I understand the passage. You might set a goal of, I will slow down at the beginning of the passage so that I can avoid rereading, which is the thing that's slowing me down the most right now. You want to think about something specific that you can do to help yourself move through a passage more quickly. I will pay more attention when I read. That's a great outcome-oriented goal. How are you going to accomplish that? Maybe you are going to pause and summarize at the end of each paragraph. That's kind of making that passage map that many of you are sharing would be helpful for you. Maybe you are going to ask questions as you read. Maybe you're going to learn about mindfulness and you're going to practice some mindfulness techniques to help you with the different negative thoughts that are floating in your head. Read the answers more carefully. That's what folks often say when they miss a question and then they go back and they review and they're like, oh shoot, didn't see that word. This totally makes sense on second glance. This is great, but you want to think about what specifically are you going to pay attention to. So for example, maybe you're going to say, I will preview the answers for strong language. So maybe you're missing words sometimes because the word most or best doesn't pop out at you, but it tends to make answers wrong. Another common one is folks don't read with equal attention to the end of the answer choice. So I will read to the end of every answer choice is a great way to avoid picking an answer that has some problematic parts at the very end of it. Yeah, I can go over what a passage map is again. So a passage map is basically like an outline, but it's a pretty loose and fast outline. So the way I think about it is I'm just kind of trying to break the passage into chunks. The natural breaking point would be paragraphs, but also a lot of times LSAT passages aren't that well organized, and so they really need to be broken up a little further. And I want those chunks to be I am able to identify what is the purpose of this section of the passage, and generally what is the content. So for example, in the passage that we just read, if I'm thinking about paragraph 1, in the opening paragraph, the purpose is to describe a problem, which is we want to restore the natural balance, and that's hard to do. And the author says this is hard and explains why that's hard. Then in the second paragraph, we start hearing about this study. that's taking place in the Netherlands. That's particularly exploring the role of microorganisms. And I'm already forgetting if this was 2 paragraphs total or 3, but it's not that important. At the end of the passage, we hear that this strategy of planting seeds and microorganisms is a potential solution to the problem. So I'm tracking, okay, this is a passage that's organized with a problem, an exploration of that problem, a study, and then a solution. And I'm also keeping general tabs on the content. So what I encourage you to do is each time you practice reading comprehension, set one of those specific strategy-oriented goals for yourself. And then after you've done a passage or question set, do some structured reflection on that goal. You don't want to assume that just because you told yourself you were going to ask questions while you read, that you're actually going to do it right away. Sometimes you're going to have to set that goal 3 times before you actually follow through with it when you're reading. So at the end of your passage reading, reflect on each step of the process. Make sure you're reviewing by finding text support and concrete reasons for correct and incorrect answers. Write down your takeaways, just the same way that y'all in the chat were saying, okay, what I learned here is I want to continue to read at the pace I'm reading, or I want to start to incorporate a passage map into my practice. And then frequently review your takeaways and keep track of your progress. Are the new habits that you're building sticking? And are there still additional habits that you want to build? All right, thank you all for coming. I hope this was helpful. I'll put our website back up if you're interested in checking out some of our upcoming classes so that you can get a deeper dive into reading comp or additional instruction in logic games and LR. Thank you all and have a lovely week.